Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Watermark Search webinar on the future of work post-COVID-19. I'm Lisa McAuliffe, and I'm a partner in the Watermark Interim practice here in Sydney. And today I'm joined by my colleagues, Caroline McAuliffe, Suzanne Mulverhill, and Alicia Wilson from our Sydney office, and Jacinta Whelan and Donna Burr, our partners in our Melbourne office. Today's webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes and we will be recording, so there's no need to take any notes. Rest assured, all your information will remain private, so none of your personal details will be shared. We will be asking some polling questions throughout, so please help us make this webinar as interactive as possible and jump on and vote. There will also be an opportunity for Q&A at the end, so you can ask your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many as possible as time permits. However, if we don't, we will follow up via an email with the responses to all the questions and also the recording of the session. Today's topic is foremost in all our minds. I'm sure many of us feel like we've been springboarded into the future almost overnight, which for some is quite exciting and liberating. But for others, I'm sure it's a little bit more challenging and daunting, depending on our personal circumstances. I know that some people have felt like the worlds of work and family have collided and that they've struggled to manage competing demands. Yet I think on the whole, a large majority of us have enjoyed some of the benefits that we've experienced, being a little bit more work-life balance, reconnecting with family, and doing more exercise and eating well. In some ways, certainly not all, but some, COVID-19 has been a great leveler. It doesn't matter who you are or what industry you work in, everybody has been impacted. And work as we know it is never going to be the same again. So transformation and change is inevitable, but what does that look like? And how do we prepare ourselves for what lies ahead? To help us with these questions and more, today we're delighted to welcome one of our interim executives, Natalie Ranki-Goldman, who is going to share her thoughts and experience in this regard. Natalie is a leading expert in flexible working and previous CEO of Flex Careers. She's been an advocate in this space for over 10 years now, where she's been working with companies embedding and normalizing flexible work practices. Just before I hand over to Natalie, I just want to give you a quick update, however, on our Watermark and our team. So like everybody else, we've been adapting to our new way of working and embracing the new technologies at hand, such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and they've allowed us to remain close to our clients and interim executives. It's been business as usual for us, so we've been fully operational. We've continued to work on critical assignments throughout this period. What we have been hearing and seeing, however, in the market is that the pandemic has highlighted some of the critical areas within organizations where there are gaps. And when I say gaps, I mean in terms of expertise. So we're anticipating, as the restrictions continue to lessen slightly over the next couple of months, there will be an increase in interim requirements, as clients will need to seek out immediate skill sets to solve problems or to kickstart some new projects that are going to come out of this crisis. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this in terms of what's happening within your own organizations and what areas you've seen that you've noticed that do require urgent attention. So with that, I'm going to ask today's, the first of today's polling questions in that regard. So we're just going to bring that up on the screen. There it is. So what we'd like you to do is vote, if you will, and choose your top 3 areas within your business that you believe are going to require urgent attention. Okay, so there we go, the results are in. Okay, so coming in at 71%, we've got IT and digital, which makes sense. followed by customer experience and service, and then financial risk. So that is in line with what we're seeing in terms of companies moving forward and reinventing themselves and the way they're changing their operations in terms of servicing their clients. So thank you for voting there. We're certainly seeing that the depth of experience that our pool of interim executives can offer organisations at this point in time is proving invaluable. And certainly those that have that crisis management experience are especially sought after for their sage advice in terms of facing and overcoming some of the challenges ahead. So finally, I'd just like to share with you, before we move on to Natalie's presentation, a useful infographic that outlines some of the changes that organisations are going to be facing in the new world of work. So you'll see here potentially HR policies that need to be changed and amended for the new structures we're seeing. We're looking at organisations determining what employees need to be upskilled and how quickly, or whether they need to parachute in additional resources, as we've previously mentioned there. There's going to be offices looking at office space, hot desking, so many things to consider as we move forward into this new world of work. But one thing that's not actually listed there on that list is one thing that we all need to be mindful is that it's going to be a very emotive journey for some. So there will need to be processes and systems in place to support our mental health. And we all need to look out for each other in that regard. So look after our employees and our colleagues. So as I mentioned, we will share that with you along with the rest of the presentation in the coming days. From us at Watermark here, we're obviously here to support you. So if you have any questions or we can help in any way, please do reach out. But for now, I shall stop talking, and without further ado, I shall hand over to Natalie.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you to the entire Watermark team for having me here today. Even the title itself, The Future of Work Post-COVID-19, when initially we were having conversations around having this webinar and I created the content for this, we caught up late last week ahead of today's webinar, and we discussed how even a title like that, things are changing so quickly that the reality is that it's not the future of work post-COVID-19, it's our work today, which is the future of work, by being around flexible working or the use of technology in ways that were thought of maybe in future years are being used today. But it's not post-COVID, it's going to be in COVID. And although we're managing to suppress the numbers and keep them quite low, we are still living daily with the reality of how do we do this and how does work look like. So that really sets the scene for what we're going to be discussing today, which I'll discuss on the next slide. So the overview of today's webinar is really about how do we address the constant change and fluidity in our workplaces? What does it look like today? What will it look like tomorrow, let alone next week, month, quarter, or year? So we'll be setting the scene. What will work look like in that time? What will we need to prepare in regards to how our employees might want to work? Focusing on our leaders, how they're the linchpin to all that change that Lisa was referring to, because without taking them on the journey and without them leading the way, we're going to be lost without them. We'll be looking at the technology and infrastructure, as well as the innovation, creativity and change that's going to be fundamental to managing a lot of these issues. And we'll also focus on the executive remuneration path around what does this all mean in regards to that. And last but definitely not least, what will the path to recovery look like for your organisation and for your business going forward? So we'll start with setting the scene. Where are we now? Well, in most parts of Australia, the restrictions are starting to ease. Schools are starting to open up. People to start back again. But I don't feel like we're going to have a snap back, what Scott Morrison was initially talking about, that we're just going after a certain period of time of isolation or quarantine, things will just snap back into place as they were beforehand. I think by now, everybody is very cognizant of the fact that things can't go back to how they were. We still need to do social distancing, a lot of parts of our economy affected, high numbers of unemployment, the fact that our economy is so reliant on the global economy and so many other countries are still so terribly affected. In Australia, we're very, very fortunate that thankfully COVID has not really impacted us from a health perspective too badly. I mean, we have had deaths, which is tragic, but when you look at some of the numbers that are happening overseas, Australia is a very, very good place to be. So let's start from the health perspective, from the human impact. Where are we today? So with restrictions easing and people getting about their daily lives a little bit more, it means that we're going to be starting to see a little bit of normality coming back to place. But we still need to, of course, have social distancing in place in all aspects, including in the workplace. We'll touch on that in a little bit. The transition back into the workforce. Well, just last week, Twitter released a post, a blog in regards to the fact that they're planning on opening up later this year with their offices. However, they were very clear to say that they don't expect their employees to come back. In fact, it's up to the employee as to whether or not they'll work out of their office, and they are welcome to work from home indefinitely. This is a massive shift in regards to the onus of who chooses to work where and how. It's a huge shift in regards to conversation around trust. And it's a huge shift to say, well, we're not quite sure where we'll be in 3 months' time, and we're not quite sure what that looks like. So if an employee feels like, at Twitter anyway, that they would like to work from home, as so many are at the moment, then maybe that's something to be considered. But the reality is many offices and organisations will need to have people, but what that looks like we'll touch on in a little bit. The great thing about these kinds of challenges is that there are things that need to be fixed or changed. And until we're faced with a crisis or we're really in a situation where we need to change, necessity is the true mother of invention, and innovation is going to be our savior here. We'll be looking at different types of industries and what's happening in those spaces, but this is going to provide us with an incredible opportunity to create and forge a new path forward, not just for us in Australia, but for globally as well. Now, the term future of work is so often bandied around. I speak at a number of conferences and have worked in this space for quite some time. The reality is that the future of work is actually here today. And what do I mean by that? Now, we could look at it from the conversation around flexible working. So that meaning basically the ability to work where, when, and how you would like. But it's also the fact that, for example, in the health industry, telehealth was meant to come into Australia in about 10 years' time. From a budget perspective, there was money being allocated over the next 10 years to be able to implement that across all our GPs and our health services. That has been fast-tracked. Currently, all GPs in Australia now have telehealth, even vets have them. And so that means that we've pretty much fast-tracked 10 years. The technology was available, but the funding wasn't. But the necessity is that we have it now. And so subsequently, we're starting to see a lot of things happening today that would have happened in the future. So going forward, what do we need to do to help prepare our organisations to welcome people back into the office? We need to start thinking about how important is it that we have people physically in the office? Is it a necessity? We need to remember that we can't have too many people in the same place, to Lisa's point. We saw as restrictions were coming into place, there were some teams, organisations that were rotating staff, that they'd have stream A or stream B. People would come in on certain days and others would work from home and vice versa. We're going to start to see a lot more of those kinds of conversations around flexible working, around how people want to do it, as well as how employers want to do it, as well as clients. So these are things that are going to evolve over the coming months, and we'll look at that in a little bit more perspective down the line. So we'll start on the next slide. But first, before we go into that, we have a poll. In this poll, I'm going to ask you to pick 3 choices of the kind of flexible working that you have done prior to the lockdown. Not currently, but prior to the lockdown. Okay, so as we would all expect, working from home was something that was probably the most common, and now even more so. But the other two was working from a different location and different start and finish times. So these are probably what I would have seen as well prior to COVID as probably the three most common as well. It's interesting to see that we had 3% who said none of the above, as well as another 3% who said all of the above. So what this says to me is it's a really good reflection of the people who are here today are probably reflective of the organisations that I have worked with previously. Prior to COVID-19 especially. But I think what we're going to see is that this will change to a range of different types of flexible working. So now let's have a quick chat around what is flexible working. A lot of conversation prior to COVID as well as now is flexible working is the ability to work from home. The reality is that flexible working is part of that, yes, is the definition is to be able to work from home. But the broader definition is the ability to negotiate how, where, and when you work. And one of the key terms I would like to point out is the word negotiate. So when we say that is that the ability for an individual, an employee, to work together with their manager or their team to discuss the different types of ways that they could be working that could support them to achieve the best outcomes that they need to do, as well as what's needed by the organisation, the team, and really importantly, your clients and your customers. So as we're faced by so much uncertainty and change, having a flexible mindset or a fluid mindset, let's use that word maybe for this purpose of today's webinar, is really important because things will be changing and needing to adapt. Flexible working isn't for everyone. Some people will have loved working from home in this time. Other people have found it a real struggle for a variety of reasons. However, once the restrictions ease, life isn't just going to snap back. We still have responsibilities, whether that be children or our aged parents who are really affected by this disease. And so we need to take into account the fact that there are going to be a lot of different pressures on individuals working, and what are the things that they're going to need to be able to be a full and productive employee. To Lisa's point, she said the Watermark team are fully operational. And it's quite interesting to say that I've spoken to quite a number of companies, whether it be construction companies or tech companies and a variety of different industries, who've all said that despite a few glitches, they've found that productivity hasn't dropped that significantly, despite the fact that very quickly everybody had to change how they worked. However, going back and looking at what that looks like going forward is going to require some level of strategy and some level of conversation within teams and organisations around what is going to work best from a health and safety perspective, from a duty of care perspective, from a client perspective, from an employee and team perspective. There's a number of things that need to be taken into account. So one of the things we are seeing, which is a really great side effect of the COVID disease, is that in a workplace, we're starting to recognise the importance of the humans that work there. So no more are we going forward and saying that we need to soldier on if you're a little bit sick. No more will that happen. In fact, we're going to make sure that everyone who does come into contact with other people in the workplace needs to be healthy. And if they're not well, they need to stay at home. We need to take care of each other. The other aspect to all of this is that there's going to be a lot more focus on trust, because now that we've seen that we can work from home and in various locations, we still get the job done. We still want to achieve great things. So it's focusing more on the outcomes as opposed to watching somebody at their seat to make sure that they're doing their job. So what we're seeing is a shift from the old school industrial style leadership of command and control through to more of a collaborative, outcomes-based, trust-based type of leadership. So that is really important, particularly as you go forward through the uncertainty of COVID, that things will continue. Rules and legislation will change, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do. We'll see there'll be less travel. There might be more things on technology. How do we lead that? How do we manage remote teams? These things will need to adapt. There'll need to be clear guidelines on what that looks like, and particularly around the additional responsibilities, meaning employees will need to be more self-led in regards to making sure that they do what they need to be doing. Leaders need to be taking more responsibility for their leadership style, and there needs to be clarity around who's doing what and where. Now, one of the really interesting side effects around this conversation around how employees want to work going forward is we've seen a quiet revolution take place. And what do I mean by that? Because of the fact that quite a number of people who are working from home have also had children in their homes at the same time, home learning, including my very own, what we've seen is something really interesting. This quiet revolution is that suddenly you have two parents in the house who are working from home, hopefully that people have kept their jobs, or if they haven't, it's not based on gender, it's more based on the fact that there are parents there who need to look after children, where there's cooking and cleaning and home learning and shopping and all the life stuff that happens. And it's shifted the roles within a family. So no more is it the woman's role to do X and a man's role to do Y. Many families have actually needed to start to take up a conversation to say, well, how do we make this work? So if I do the morning shift with the kids and you get to work and then flip it over, these are things that have become a real conversation. So going forward, as the kids go back to school and work starts shifting back to a slow transition back into the offices, what we're going to start seeing is that hopefully these gender roles are going to start getting a little bit redefined as to who's responsible for what, and much more of a sharing of that load. But we will have to wait and see what happens going forward. So on the next slide, we'll be starting to talk about what are the benefits. So flexible working is something that has been wanted by employees for quite a long time. And a number of employers have been really resistant to it for a number of reasons. But now we kind of have to do it. It's not a question of whether it's a nice to have. Yes, there are some fantastic reasons, but let's just look at some of the benefits, because there is definitely a business case to have it, separate to the fact that it's a necessity due to health requirements and public safety. So one of the big ones is less rent, because if you have less people coming to the office, you need less space, and subsequently you have less cost. There's also less office infrastructure costs associated. We're finding right now, due to COVID, there'll be less travel, definitely internationally, but even domestically. A lot more technology use, such as Zoom, and as Lisa mentioned, around Microsoft Teams. And there are a number of other technology, which I'll refer to in a moment, around ways that we can communicate. Flexible working increases profitability because it increases productivity. People are more engaged and less absenteeism. And that's not necessarily not just turning up to work or not turning up to work, it's also mental absenteeism, so not giving effort. So when people are working flexibly, people tend to be more engaged and give a lot more effort. Due to the less of a commute, there's the ability to get more work done, and people are more refreshed, and yeah, it makes people a lot happier to do that. And last but not least, you have a much healthier workforce. I don't know about you, but I've never done so much exercise in my life. My poor dog looks at me every day of, please, no more walking. I've already done 2 today. It's fantastic that we are in a situation where we can do that, because it's the only way we've been able to get outside, apart from maybe shopping. So it's been a really important mental health, but also physically. So in order to maintain that kind of healthy workforce, this is another great way to look at it, from making sure that our people stay safe and healthy and well. So we'll start talking about the next conversation around the leadership piece. But before we do that, we have another poll. So leadership is really at the linchpin of any change. So from your perspective, please pick your top 3 as what are the really important skills that our leaders need to have going forward. I think the results will pop up. amazing. 98% communication skills is the most important, followed by adaptability and empathy. So these are really interesting, because if we did this poll maybe 6 months ago, I think the conversation would be quite different. But I can see that most of you are recognizing the real need to focus on the human side of this situation, but at the same time, the communication is an absolute standout for everybody. Being effective communicators is absolutely essential. And all of those of you like myself who have been involved in transformational change, the number one thing is communicate, communicate, communicate. So let's talk about the conversation around why leadership is so important and why are they the linchpin to this situation. Our leaders are the ones within any organisation that are the communicators. So they're the ones that our employees look to find out what's going on, especially when things are changing so rapidly. But in order for our leaders to be able to communicate effectively, they need to be given the information that they need. It needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, there needs to be an understanding of why this is happening, so that they are able to understand and be able to answer all the different questions that are asked of them. They are the ones that will be inspiring the teams and leading the way, but at the same time managing the situations as well, which is a different skill set in total. But our leadership are going to be really critical and crucial. So we need to be in a position to skill them up in able to be able to do what they need to do. And if communication is so very important, if you were to think about the level of communication skills in your leadership team right now, is that something that you think that maybe they need to be given more skill sets and more tools to be able to support them through all of that? The other area, for example, that will definitely need for leaders to be skilled up is around leading teams. This is something that a number of leaders have been pushed into because of the way that we've all suddenly had to work in isolation, or even importantly remotely, where you have organisations where you have mixed office sites and some places are still functioning, such as construction sites or remote teams. These are skills that just don't happen for everyone. Some are more natural at these type of skills, but these are the kinds of things that are really important, because leading a remote team and leading a flexible team is very different to leading a team where everyone is sitting around you. So knowing how to communicate using technology, learning how to ensure that your team know what's going on, keeping them engaged. How do you make sure that the health and well-being of your people is the level that you need it to be? So your leadership need to be able to be skilled up to be able to understand, what does that look like? What is expected of them? And so the great question now is, well, how do you go about doing that? Well, there's a number of different ways that you can do that. Well, whether you've got an internal L&D team, or you have somebody that you bring in through Watermark, or you might even look to doing an online learning program, or all three. The point is that you will at what are the sets that you need to really beef up your leadership team in particular, and your organisation as a whole, to be able to deal with the constant changes that are going to be coming away. Things will not be settling down for a long time. Our economy is opening up here in Australia, albeit very slowly, but the rest of the world is still a little bit disjointed. It is not everybody in the same position that we are. So it's really important that we give our leaders the skills, but also really importantly that we role model what we're wanting of our leaders. So that requires our senior leadership team to role model what is expected of the rest of the leadership team, and the leaders are then going to be role modeling for the middle management and so on. And role modeling is the kind of thing that if you're going to be expecting, for example, that it's okay for people to continue to work from home, that your senior leaders are seen to be doing that too. And we've seen a real shift. I've been having conversations with a number of senior leaders and CEOs here in Australia and globally. And initially it was a bit of a shock to see them in their home, with occasional child or pet running across the Zoom screen. But it also made people much more human, and it showed sides to us to being that, you know what, we're in this together. And it actually, a number of people have actually commented that seeing a senior leader or even a CEO in that kind of an environment actually gave them a lot more authenticity and credibility as a leader. And that was definitely something that's really quite interesting. So let's not forget that in these changing times, we need to support our leaders, because they will be into the change forward. So now we're going to talk on our next slide around the importance of innovation, creativity, and change. Now, as I mentioned before, there are buzzwords flying around like future of work, but innovation is something that is really absolutely critical. So as I mentioned as well, because of the changes that we're going through, and that changes the necessity of invention, and we go through these things because we're pushed to the wall, and we're now coming up with things that we may not have ever thought of using technology. Now, Zoom, for example, has been around for 5 years, yet up until about 4 months ago, many people didn't even know it existed. And anyone who had Zoom shares is now very, very, very happy. However, the reality is there's been a lot of technology that has been available to us, but we've never thought to use it. We've worked in a certain way because that's how we've always worked. We've never challenged the absolute foundations of how things were done. But now we're at a crossroads within our organizations and even our country and even our global economy. So we look at certain industries and certain ways we even do things, and we need to start questioning things. Is this the best way forward? Now, some situations we may not be able to do things. We may not be able to travel. We will not be shaking hands with people when we greet them. So how do we do business meetings? How do we go about meeting with clients? How do relationships get built? Things in a very fundamental way have changed. So it's a really great opportunity for us to start thinking about, well, if we could do things differently, if we are in a situation when we can reimagine our organization in a much better way, what could that look like? And that is where innovation comes into place. The entrepreneurial thinking and the startup ecosystem is a fantastic example of how things can be done. And you look at countries like Israel, the startup nation, who they are incredible in regards to innovation, the amount of money they spend on their R&D and in regards to building up and supporting that innovative and entrepreneurial thinking. These are the things that we are going to need in order to really kickstart our economy. And so a number of companies have already started working with startups here in Australia and globally to start bringing in that kind of thinking. But you don't need to go outside to be able to do that. It is a way of pivoting and being agile in thought and being creative, but also open to the concept that things will not go back to how they were. So what can we do going forward? So it's a fantastic opportunity to think differently about the problems that are presented to us. And often our employees provide an incredible wealth of knowledge because they have lived experience. They are at the front line. They are dealing with customers. They know the policies. They know the processes. How can we do things better? And technology and infrastructure, as you commented in your poll at the beginning, is one of the big things that you're going to look at addressing. And thankfully, we don't have to wait for the future for work to come to today. We actually have access to so many cloud-based systems that allow us to collaborate, whether they be free tools. I mean, even Zoom you can get for free. Admittedly, you'll get bumped off after 40 minutes, but you can use a number of enterprise level platforms where you can be able to collaborate. You are able to work together as a remote team and find new ways of working and looking at the infrastructure that you need to support what it is that you want to achieve. The necessity is the mother of all invention, because what I've seen over the years in organizations that have wanted to work flexibly, some people have been pushed into it. Prior to COVID, a couple of years ago, out at Macquarie Park, the being shut down, and a number of large companies out there were suddenly faced with the reality that 2/3 of their workforce would not be able to get to work because the number of buses and car spots that were available would not be able to fill the number of people that were required to come to work. So I worked with a number of them to be able to, over a 6 to 12 month period, embed and normalize flexible working. And it's quite interesting, all of them maintained it once that train station reopened, and they all found, as you saw on the benefits slide before around flexible working, is that productivity, not only did it not drop, it increased. Their engagement of their people increased. profitability increased. So sometimes, although we're looking at a lot of change and a lot of things happening very quickly, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Yes, there's a lot of hard work to be had. There's going to be a lot of recovery time. Things are going to be sluggish and slow, but it's also an opportunity, a time for great change and to make things grow in a really interesting direction. So we need to now assess which way are we going to go and make sure to think differently and outside of that box. So now we're going to touch on another conversation around executive remuneration. And in preparing for today's session, it's quite interesting to see what organisations are doing what. And we've heard of different companies, for example, cutting board fees or taking bonus cuts or reducing their rates. And so there's some few key tips that I wanted to share with you when thinking about this within your organisation. So the first thing is that we need to look at what impact will COVID-19 have on your business. Now, depending on what industry you're in, it will impact you differently, but without a doubt, no area within our economy, no industry within our economy is going to be left untouched. Some will be definitely much more impacted than others. So subsequently, there is no one size fits all to that answer around how do you want to go about looking at executive remuneration. You need to look at what's relevant within your industry, your size of your organisation, and so on. Within that, you want to establish a really robust framework for exercising discretion. So you want to make sure that all those adjustments need to be consistent, but it also needs to be done within a framework. So it's not just you have one area does one thing and another area does another. You want to make sure that there is incredible consistency across the board. You want to also make sure that all remuneration should be on the table. Again, it's about that consistency. You don't want to pick and choose, and you want to keep it open and transparent in that perspective, because unless you do, there'll be a lot of conversation around how do you go about doing one person and not another. And these are really key important times when we have to maintain trust. We also need to consider the shareholder expectations. What's going on in the market? Conversation that's happening amongst the shareholders and the community, and what is that projection and what are you going to be communicating out there. So if your competitors are doing certain things, it's important to take into account what they've been doing, and if they're not doing something, do you want to be a leader in that space and be seen to be doing certain things. So it's important to take all these different aspects to go forward. Last but definitely not least, it's about being realistic about the go forward. Now, as I mentioned, Scott Morrison a couple of months ago was saying, yep, we're going to snap back into the economy. I think everybody's realized that's not what it is. Bernard Salt had a really interesting article yesterday about saying, well, it could be that, which he doesn't think it is. It could be the V, where we slump down into recession and bounce back really quickly. However, more and more economists tend to think that it's going to be more of a step type approach, where we're going to be seeing some level of growth and then a plateau and more of a growth and then a plateau, because it's also going to be linked to the public health situation, the global economy. There are so many other variables. So it's important that whatever decisions you make around executive remuneration, that you be fully aware and be flexible, but also realistic about the go forward, and making sure that there's clarity in where you want to be and flexibility. So some more information around this can be found through the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and a few links through there to be able to support your decisions around what you might want to do in that space. And now taking the conversation to the path to recovery for your business. So where are we today? As I mentioned, things are starting to ease up in Australia, which is really wonderful news. We've done a fantastic job. We've all been great at our social distancing and maintained some really low numbers. Our focus has been on health and the greater good. And that's something that I think Australia should be really proud of, because despite your few people that may have broken rules and few sort of things that we've seen in the paper that you kind of might roll your eyes at, the majority of us have really done a fantastic job. So now we're faced with a situation where we need to stay focused on our employees' health. We have a duty of care in regards to that. What does that look like? hot desking probably won't be happening going forward, increase in cleaning, spacing of desks within offices, and even that conversation of how many people will we have in our offices. So we need to make sure that we continue to focus on that. And to Lisa's point, it's not just the physical health, it's also mental health. We've seen that there is a new position in the government for the Deputy Health Officer who is committed to mental health, and that is their complete remit. We know that this situation is creating a lot of stress and pressure for a lot of people in many different ways. And so we need to be able to support our people and each other, and health will need to continue to be at the centre of our focus of this pandemic. But now we're starting to see a shift to the economic focus, to the reopening of our market. It's a really great thing for us. We know that this is something that a lot of people are wanting. As we slowly start to ramp up, it means that we're going to hopefully have more jobs coming up. But will there be another wave? Most likely, but how big will that wave be? And when I say another wave, I'm talking about from a health perspective. Because what we're going to start to see is as the restrictions ease, there will be more people who will unfortunately get COVID-19, but that's just the nature of things. We need to minimise the people, of course, who are the most vulnerable in our society and keep people out of hospital. So we know that it'll happen, but how quickly we do it is why we're doing it in a staged approach, and so that we know that our economy will start ramping up more and more. And as I mentioned before, entrepreneurial thinking and innovation is going to be really, really fundamental in regards to helping your business and your organization find its path back. So not just clicking back to the way things were, but recognizing that customers are going to want to engage very differently with you. They may not want to see you physically that much anymore. They might be very comfortable with seeing you online. So how do you prepare and plan and support your salespeople in regards to that? How do you support your customers in regards to online engagement? And companies that have spent a number of years already building a lot of that kind of online customer service have led the way to show us the kind of ways that we can actually engage with customers in a really effective way forward. So it's really important that we keep an open mind to that, and also reflective of if what we don't want though is things get worse from a health perspective, things will get pulled back. So what does that mean for us within our businesses and our organizations? So these are the kinds of things that we need to keep in mind, and going forward with regards to relaxing of all the laws and the ways that we go back into the workplace, things will be a little bit stop-start for quite some time. So I believe that was my last slide. And wanted to say, if you want to connect in with me, feel free to reach out. Here's my contact details. I'd be more than happy to have that conversation with you. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I'll hand over back to Lisa.
Thank you, Natalie, for such an informative session. It's obviously a topic that we could speak about for a lot longer. It's a shame we only have limited time today, but as you say, I think what's come out of this is, amongst other things, is that communication is key, not only from our leaders, but it's our own responsibility as well to communicate what works for us, and then in terms of what works for the company and also the company's clients. But it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. We've got lots of questions that have come through, so I'm just conscious of time, but perhaps we can squeeze in at least one. In terms of industries moving forward, as things begin, as the recovery takes place, we've been asked, what other industries do you believe will bounce back or flourish as recovery starts to take place? So this person's potentially mentioned manufacturing as one.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've found really interesting is, yes, we're still very much part of a global economy, but because Australia is opening up much quicker, as is New Zealand and many other economies and countries in the world, we are very reliant on a lot of our manufacturing, for example, has been taken overseas over the last number of decades. And so we've become very reliant on importing things from glass jars to a number of plastics or metal or all sorts of different things. Even though we have so much resources here in Australia, we are in a very fortunate position. So what we will start to see, and a lot of conversation has already started taking place, and I was just speaking with the head of the Manufacturing Association late last week on this very topic, that manufacturing will probably see a resurgence here in Australia, partly because out of necessity, the factories that we normally would purchase things from overseas are just not operational, or if they are operating, we actually can't import them into the country for a number of different reasons. So from supply chain and logistics perspectives. So a lot of people are now starting to think about, well, how can we become more self-sufficient, and what aspects can we actually see flourish? We also start to see a lot more conversation around working together with New Zealand, and what are the kind of partnerships can we be doing to support one another. But also going back to the conversation around innovation and entrepreneurial thinking, we're starting to see a lot of startups coming up with really simple ideas, whether it be technology around customer service, whether it's about workspaces and design. For example, that Perspex paneling that we're now seeing almost commonplace in shops has become suddenly a new market. Will that become a new part of workforce? So what we're going to start seeing is a number of different areas growing quite significantly in direct response to COVID, but also as a result of people being really clever and seeing the opportunities for people to say, well, what are the kinds of things that we were looking at externally? So for example, with travel, there's now a massive push around domestic travel in the coming months. So what Australian tourism looks like as opposed to international tourism. So those kinds of things will shift the conversation as well as industries going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm afraid we're probably going to have to wrap up now, just looking at the time. So we really appreciate your input today. And thank you to everybody who's attended. I hope you found the webinar valuable. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can help and assist in any way. And we will, of course, be sharing this with you over the coming days. So have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Bye for now.